This is week 14, chapter 13 on community power and planning and other things that you'll see in the chapter. The first question is, what is community power debate about? Well, it's about elitism and pluralism. And I've got kind of a working definition of each here side by side. On the left is elitism, as you can see, and basically let's get into that. Elitism is says that society is divided into the upper class and the rest of us. All the important decisions are made by elites or the upper class, the 1% or whatever we would call them today. The important resources are economic, that is, money and property in the hands of the elites. They're the only ones who have this. And the last thing is that public policy benefits the elite. So if you look at something like the tax code, it benefits the wealthy. That's what the elitism would argue. And if you look at any meaningful public policy that has to do with zero-sum game, that is, some people win, some people lose, limited pie, whatever way you want to look at it, elites seem to always win, and the small guy always seems to take it in the neck. Anyway, that's the way elitism, or what elitism says. If you notice a similarity to communism or Marxism, it is pretty much the same thing. Karl Marx said all those things. On the other side, you have pluralism, and that's sort of what I would call the political science view of democracy. There's, first of all, interest groups, not economic elites, control the government. The second thing is that the interest groups compete with one another. No one interest group has all the power, so they have to compete with each other, and they have to compromise because they don't have all the power. And that results in some kind of what we would call public interest. Sounds like Thoreau, pretty much, and Rousseau, people like that, who talked about how somehow magically compromising in government reaches a public interest. Another thing that's different about pluralism is that political resources are important, not just economic resources. And that would be voting, organizational control of people, and as well as economic resources. So in other words, if you can get a number of people together and you can vote as a block, that gives you political power. Or if you have ability to organize, you can provide volunteers in campaigns, and that'll help you become powerful without having economic resources or money. And the last thing, of course, is what I already mentioned, that's the public interest prevails. It comes out of the compromise that's worked out by interest groups. Second question is, what impact does planning and zoning have on local politics? Well, there's a number of things that I've listed here. One is that it enables a design for the community. If you have planning and then you enforce that with zoning laws, you'll make sure that the community looks like what you originally wanted to look like. So essentially, if you look at the second one, you create residential, commercial, industrial zones. So you have a place for living quarters where people live in the community, single family homes or apartment buildings or some combination of that kind of thing, whatever way you want to design it. And that becomes a residential area. Commercial areas where all the stores are, where people shop, and then industrial area would be where you would have factories or any form of that kind of thing that we might have in America. We don't produce much anymore, but if you look at Chicago back in the day, in the last century, there was quite a bit of that. So you have new development can be controlled and subjected to voter approval this way. So if there's a decision, well, we want to have high rises, like for example in Santa Fe, um, almost all the buildings are what you'd have to label some kind of low rise buildings, even hotels, motels, whatever. They only go up 2 or 3 stories at the most, and so everything's low level. And so if somebody wanted to build a high rise, that would go against the community zoning laws, and they'd have to get permission. And oftentimes, in order to get permission, you need voter approval, and at least it gives the voters, even if you don't need voter approval, you get the opportunity for the citizens who live there to voice their opposition to it or support for it, whatever it is. It also helps to make for a more livable community. You could see what that discussion in the book, but the argument is that if you have all these different zones, it makes it easier for people and better for people to live. It's more comfortable. You know where the parks are, you know where the schools are, and they're in the right relationship. But people don't have to cross over a commercial area or industrial area to get to school. And the last thing is it protects the investment in homes and businesses. If people are going to invest their money, which in fact people do if they buy a home or buy a business, they're able to be reassured that they're going to be able to recoup from this investment. So in other words, if you buy a home, you can and you've got zoning laws, you can rest assured that they're not going to build a gas station next door to you, that sort of thing. Number 3, what makes planning and zoning so political? Well, many people want changes in the existing plan. After a while, there's always going to be people who think they can make money or want some fundamental changes in the existing plan. Usually plans are made for 10 years or so, and by that time there's different kinds of attitudes or feelings about the plan. Maybe it should be altered in one way or another. For example, here in Santa Fe, there's a big dispute going on about whether they should build a truck stop out here on Highway 25, right on the edge of the commercial area off of a major thoroughfare here, Cerrillos. And the public is really upset about it, and there's been meetings and all that kind of stuff. But it's a typical example of what happens. You've got these zoning laws that prohibit that kind of thing, and then there's a plan that suggests that maybe in the future you could do it. When the future comes, they propose it, and then, like with this situation, all hell is breaking loose. Second thing is you can lobby to change planning and zoning. That makes it very political because they're always doing that. No matter what the plan is, what the zoning rules are, there are people trying to get the legislature to change those things. There are committees of the city council, for example, that deal with planning and zoning, and they're constantly being bombarded with recommendations to change those laws, and oftentimes it leads to some kind of corruption as well, where they get bribed if they'll do it. And the last thing I would say about this is that conflict is inevitable, that whenever you do something or design something, there's going to be people who want to change it. And it's the natural order of things. And so it becomes, for all these reasons, it's very, very political. The last one is number 4, what is happening in transportation policy these days? Well, if you look at transportation, and we could have picked on any of the other ones that are in the book, but we'll focus on transportation here. Transportation policy is based on cars and private transportation. So people own their own private transportation and they move around that way. That's been the sort of history of local areas in America. We buy a car. We fell in love with the car back in the days when it was mass assembled by Ford back in the early part of the 20th century, and we've been in love with the car ever since. And then we petitioned the government to build roads so we don't have to drive on dirt roads, although we still got dirt roads, a lot of dirt roads here in some places in New Mexico. But anyway, so transportation is pretty much private. We've become accustomed to that. We fell in love with cars. We love our car, all that kind of stuff. And it's supported, the process of promoting cars and private transportation is supported by the gasoline tax. So the gasoline tax will pay for the roads, also whatever else we pay with cars and trucks and um, whatever we're driving. We have to get licenses and license plates, and all the money for that kind of stuff is generally going into the transportation system, which generally means roads and then policing roads and cleaning roads if you get snow and other debris on the road. So all of that stuff is part of what we would call the transportation system. And then somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, you got problems developing because of private transportation that we face today. The problems are probably worse than they were when we first noticed them back in the 1970s. So you've got such things as air pollution, climate change, a shortage of oil, the cost of oil going up and up because of the limited amount available in the world. More and more countries using fossil fuel oil, like China. As China develops and progresses, they're using more of this stuff than we are. So all of this, which are the essential problems of private transportation in the 21st century, all of this stuff suggests that we should move to a different system. So in other words, that we should shift to public transportation, cabs, buses, trains. But this is very difficult to achieve given the fact that that is, public transportation advocates, are up against the highway lobby. That's everybody involved in developing cars, all the car manufacturers, the oil producers, the contractors involved in building roads and so on. Everybody involved in the process of private transportation, known as the highway lobby. All of those people are opposed to public transportation. And then when you add to it that public transportation of any type, especially the stuff that's advocated in the 21st century, like what I listed here last, high-speed rail, that stuff is very, very expensive. All of public transportation is very expensive to initiate. And so you're fighting a highway lobby. You've got a very expensive situation, and it is the solution of the 21st century, but we don't seem to get there. I mean, it's crazy that people will get on a highway and they'll go to work and it takes them 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours to get there. For example, when I used to go back and forth to Lewis from Chicago, I started out, I think my initial trip was 45 minutes. Then it went up to an hour, and then it went up to like an hour and a half, especially coming home in a rush hour. It would be at least an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And people are willing to do that, even though if you had something like, say, a train, like a bullet train, and I'm not even talking about the time it took me to get home, like if there was a snowstorm or something like that, which happens quite often, as you know, in Chicago. But if you had a bullet train between Chicago and Romeoville, It would probably take about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. And you know, how many people would opt for that? I could save 3 hours a day or 2 hours, 2.5 hours a day or whatever it is. And you know, and the problem of private transportation is only getting worse. Um, Jackie and I came back to Chicago um, last year, and we noticed how awful it was that the public system, or I should say the private system, getting worse. We were in Oak Park and places where you could easily park when we lived there. Now you had a hard time finding parking. So the problems of private transportation are only getting worse. We don't seem to be going toward the solution, which is public transportation, to solve our problems like climate change. But who knows? Who knows how long it'll last until we really take the plunge.